Picking your nose and lying down in the street might sound like rather mundane activities, but for Willie Nelson, they were some of the most influential moments of his entire life. Willie Nelson had to learn about grief and loss at a young age. His parents divorced when he was 6 months old, and then he went to live with his grandparents. His grandfather, whom he called Daddy Nelson, was a powerful figure, a blacksmith with a booming voice. But when he was just 56, he came down with a bout of pneumonia and passed away. As Nelson recounted in his memoir, "It's a long story, my life. I was devastated the way any 6-year-old boy losing the most important man in his life would be devastated. This was my first encounter with death, and the encounter could not have been closer." Fortunately, Nelson and his sister Bobby knew that they were still in loving hands with their grandmother. They endured plenty of challenges while growing up though, like having to paste newspapers to the walls for precious warmth. Plenty of people have odd nicknames, and Willie Nelson's moniker of Booger Red might just be one of the oddest in the history of nicknames. As he recounted in My Life, It's a Long Story, his grandparents insisted while raising him and his sister that they learn to be comfortable with public speaking. So, one day when he was 5 years old, he was tasked with reading a poem at a church picnic while dressed in a white sailor suit. If it sounds like a bad idea to make a little kid do that, well, it was. As Nelson wrote, "Just before I was set to go on, I started picking my nose. I was nervous and didn't realize how deeply I had dug into my skin. When I hit the stage, red blood was pouring all over my white suit." Nelson ended up ditching the poem that he was supposed to read and improvised a new one. He also told the crowd that if they didn't like his appearance, they could just look away. Before he became a legendary country music star, Nelson worked a number of odd jobs. One of them was a morning gig at a local radio station. His responsibilities included signing on at the beginning of the day, during which he was often hungover. He also hosted his own live show every day. That was how he met Johnny Bush, with whom he played together in a series of shows at a local ballroom. Like all bands, they performed their fair share of covers. One of them was a massive hit with the crowd, a little tune called Yesterday. As Nelson wrote in his book, Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die, "I thought that I had discovered an obscure song that no one had heard of before, not realizing the Beatles had just sold 90 zillion records."
What the hell was that?
Yesterday.
Nelson had a similar experience when he encountered Julio Iglesias. He was on tour in England when he heard this apparent newbie and became dead set on collaborating with him. As Nelson recalled, "I decided I had to record with this voice, whoever it was that I thought I had discovered. I found out later that he too had already sold 90 zillion records, but in 7 different languages." Willie Nelson has been candid about his early struggles. In his younger days, he had a reputation for being angry and self-destructive. After a series of fits and starts in Nashville, he had a handful of failed romantic relationships under his belt. As he wrote in his book, The Tao of Willie, "One night I got so down on myself that I lay down in the middle of the street in front of Tootsie's Orchid Lounge in Nashville and waited for a car to come by and run me over. When no cars came along for quite a while, it occurred to me that there was no one to blame for this sorry situation other than myself. I also realized that eventually it'd all turn out okay." Nelson had spent so much time imagining his life going bad that it had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. While it might not be the best idea to lie in the middle of the road to come to that realization, it went a long way to turning his life around for the better. Willie Nelson hasn't just written his own classic songs, he's also penned hits for other artists. Perhaps the biggest one of his career that was made famous by somebody else was Patsy Cline's Crazy, and he's told multiple stories about how it all came together. At the time, Cline was recovering from a devastating car accident. In one version, Nelson pitched the song to her husband/manager Charlie Dick when they were at a bar at 1 a.m. Dick was so taken with the tune that he wanted to show it to his wife right away, but Nelson didn't want to intrude at such an unreasonable hour. Dick, however, insisted.
"You don't want to go over there at midnight. I'm about half drunk and you are too."
In a somewhat different telling, Nelson knew that Cline was tired of hearing from him, so he opted to stay in the car until she insisted that he come out. Cline also reportedly initially struggled with recording the song, so she stepped away for a few days and eventually returned to the studio, and the final version was completed in one take. According to the Humane Society of the United States, 166,000 horses were sent to slaughter in 2012. While that number has decreased significantly, some people are still horrified by this practice, including Willie Nelson. In a 2019 interview, he talked about some of the free-roaming residents of his own 700-acre ranch. As it turned out, more than 70 horses were rescued right before they were shipped off to slaughter. As the country star declared, "My horses are probably the luckiest horses in the world." And they're not the only animals that Nelson has devoted plenty of time to. He's also been raising hogs on the side since high school. One time, he built a fence with a little too much of a gap, and as soon as the baby hogs ran off the truck, they just kept right on running. As Nelson recalled, by the time he retrieved them, they were nearly too big to escape again. But without room to exercise, they ended up in pretty bad shape, and he had to sell them at a loss. Willie Nelson and marijuana go together like peanut butter and jelly. As he tells it, there's a good reason for that, and it all comes down to genetics. As he wrote in his book, The Tao of Willie, "I suspect it has something to do with my Cherokee heritage." As Nelson understands it, Cherokee beliefs teach that a connection to nature is also a connection to happiness and contentment. He also explained that for generations, medicine came in the form of the plants, flowers, seeds, and herbs that grew across the country. The further away that humans get from that connection, then the worse off we are mentally, physically, and emotionally.
You like Willie Nelson?
He smoked weed, right? That's what I'm talking about, man.
Booger Red isn't Nelson's only popular nickname. He's also known as Shotgun Willie, and that one has a much darker origin story. His daughter Lana was the victim of domestic violence at the hands of her husband Steve, which led to Willie confronting his son-in-law. Steve then followed him with a rifle in hand. He fired a shot, and the bullet narrowly missed his father-in-law. Nelson then returned fire with a few shots from his M1 rifle. Later that night, he staked out his house from his truck, and when Steve returned, he used his shotgun to fire at a tire. Considering this backstory, it might be surprising to learn that Nelson has a rather strict stance about gun control. In his book, Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die, he wrote about how he played with stick guns when he was a kid and received his first real gun when he was 12 years old. But as for assault weapons, he had this to say: "Anyone with loved ones knows those should be outlawed. A handgun, a shotgun, and a deer rifle are all we really need. Period. End of story." At one point in his life, Nelson was teaching Sunday school at a Metropolitan Baptist church, which led to a bit of a dilemma. He was pulled aside and told that since he played in bars on Saturday, it wasn't appropriate for him to be teaching on Sunday. He then started reading various books on faith and came to the conclusion that reincarnation was an essential and eminently valuable part of Christianity. As he recounted in It's a Long Story, My Life, "I was drawn to the idea that you keep coming back till you get it right. Jesus got it right the first time around, but the rest of us would need several lifetimes to shed our sins and learn the lessons necessary to heal our troubled souls." Nelson has also admitted to subscribing to some of the theories of Edgar Cayce, a faith healer, psychic, and prophet who was popular in the early 20th century. In The Tao of Willie, he wrote about being drawn to Cayce's teachings that described Earth as like a library, with people as the books. Plenty of fans admire Willie Nelson, but in his book, Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die, he revealed some of the musicians that he looks up to. For one, he considers Django Reinhardt to be the best guitar player of all time. As for the best country singer, it's hands down Ray Price. Nelson has first-hand experience there, as he spent some time playing bass for Price. But when it comes to the best all-around entertainer, Nelson had this to say: "The greatest musician, singer, writer, and entertainer that I have ever seen or heard is Leon Russell."
He was a great country singer along with rock and roll and a great musician. So, yeah, and he was a good friend.
Nelson recalled playing with Russell in New Mexico and spending hours hanging out before going on stage and experiencing the surrealness of bringing thousands of people to their feet. As he wrote, "The magic was the music. It touched all kinds of people, and the world has not been the same since." Willie Nelson turned 90 in 2023 and celebrated in style with a massive party that brought some of music's biggest names together. That wasn't his idea though. As he admitted to Parade, "It's kinda gotten out of hand. I don't know how many people are coming at this point. I just hope I get to sing something with all of them." Nelson has no plans to slow down, as he's made it clear that he's going to keep performing and recording as long as people keep listening. And when he was asked how he's managed to thrive and survive for so long, he had this to say: "You have to do something every day to pay for the day. You need to run, walk, swim, sing, whatever it is that's important to you. You have to do it, and then see how long you can keep doing it."
want your legacy to be?
Oh, that I always showed up.
It's human nature to look ahead to the future, and Willie Nelson offered his own thoughts on this topic in his 2012 book, Roll Me Up and Smoke Me When I Die. He predicted that major wars would come to an end, but then it goes downhill from there. With the cost of large-scale conflict getting too costly, he foresaw the world becoming consumed by a series of small-scale skirmishes based around everyday necessities like food accessibility. As he wrote, "Think about it. If your kids are hungry, thirsty, and sick, you will do anything to save them. Anything. That's when the shit will hit the fan, and it will be everybody for themselves, like a dog-eat-dog, only the strong survive scenario." But Nelson also predicted that groups of people would find each other by looking past the things that separate us now, like religion and race. Humankind would then be able to come together only when everyone realizes that our resources need to be shared by everyone, instead of hoarded by a select few.